Very frequently, I am approached by players of relatively a lower category, and they ask me questions. I was stunned by the opening my opponent played, the opening I have never seen, and I don't know what to do and how to play against it. And most of the time, it's bad opening that was chosen by their opponents. Now, what went wrong in the game that you played against bad opening? The only thing that can go wrong in the early stage of the game is your approach to this opening. Now, our topic is bad openings and how to play against them. Because why not to play them? It's very easy. I can tell you, just don't play bad openings, and that's it. We don't need to make any material on it. But suppose your opponent plays, what is the right approach to bad openings? In order to answer this question, we have to know the definition of the bad openings. There are some openings that are not bad, but the white gets some advantage, but the other side has, one side has some advantage, the other side has some counterplay. That's not a bad opening. That's the opening maybe I shouldn't recommend to play, but it's okay to play if you really like it, you played, and you know how to play it. But bad openings are the openings that will give your opponent that will give you a bad position in the early stage of the game. And sometimes it's not necessarily very bad positions, it's worse positions, but without a counterplay. There is no upside to this opening. You're getting worse position, you have no counterplay. Now, there is no specific order we can look at these openings at. So, randomly, let's start with e4, e5, knight f3, d5. This is so-called, some of these openings that real bad openings, I never even heard of names, because names, they go by the countries they played on. So in one country they call one opening, in the other country they call the other name. So this, I just learned recently that it's called ElephantGambit. Well, I know Sicilian opening, I know Queen's Gambit, King's Indian, but ElephantGambit, it's a rather odd name. But that's what this opening goes by. Now, this is definitely wrong, because when black in a very early stage, originating early stage on move 2, quick contact in the center, being a tempo down because they play black, that cannot be right. Well, and what is the right approach for white? Right approach for white in this opening is pure simplicity. There are several ways to play this opening. There is almost no bad way to play it. So one way is e takes d, the other way is d4, and the third, well, actually this is two good continuations. Of course you can play knight c3, but you don't have to expect really good positions, because black can go d4 or d takes e. But one of the competitive and very very ambitious approaches, ed or d4. I have played many times, and in my opening DVDs I suggest d4 We all know that the opening is most important, the most important part of the game. That's where you plan your middle game. That's where you build the game according to your style and position you would like to play. And that's why we dedicate so much attention and so much time to studying opening. Well, anyway, that's the right thing to do, and if you don't, you should reconsider your way to improve. Now, a lot of people love certain openings, and some openings they don't just like to play, they like it so much that they want to play it with reverse colors, which means if they like opening for white very much, they are willing to play the same opening, well, I mean with the tempo down, but for black. What I mean is, if you like to play Sicilian for white, you may wanna try with c4 and inviting e5 and Sicilian kind of positions, which is English now. Or if you like, for example, Caro-Can for black, well, you are gonna start d4 and maybe on d5 go c3 and this type of positions. Well, against the Slav defense, if you like to play d4, d5, c4, c6, you may like to do the same thing for white with extra tempo. But no, it's not always the right thing to do. For example, openings you like for white, such as King's Indian attack. King's Indian attack, when you play knight f3, g3, d3, castle, and try to play e4 later and start like a King's Indian, like black plays, but to play for white. Now, the reason why I wouldn't recommend you Hello, my name is Roman Ginjihashvili, and this is the video about Petrov defense. Petrov defense becomes lately increasingly popular. Actually, it became popular maybe some 15 years ago, but it's been around for maybe 100 years. But 15-20 years ago it became popular, then it's kinda quieted down, and now lately it becomes increasingly popular on any levels, from beginner to the highest level, world's highest level. And there are many different ways to play this opening by white. This is the opening. There is d4 move, very popular, was very popular. Knight takes e5, and after d6, knight f3, knight takes e4, d4 move. But somehow, with the help of such a strong players as Kramnik and many others, this opening survived for black all the toughest and roughest tests. About 25 or 30 years ago even, I thought that on e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, in this position, knight c3 move was very good for white. Actually, I was taking suggestion of was then a very famous Latvian grandmaster Ivor Gipslis, who passed away, and he played a couple of games, of course on a lower level because people were not prepared for it, and he was getting good positions with taking DC. He played maybe 2 or 3 games and that was it. But then after knight a4, knight takes e4 and knight c3, black played either knight f6 or knight takes c3 and simply d5, or even bishop f5. Bishop f5 move was played in, interestingly enough, in US Championship between 2 grandmasters that agreed to a draw before the game, so they made these moves, and after taking and going d3 they agreed to a draw here. In fact, bishop f5 move is losing move. Seeing this game, Anand played many years ago when he wasn't as experienced as he is now. He played bishop f5 against Colombian grandmaster Alonso Zapata, and after queen e2 black is totally lost. It's an elementary pin on an e-file. d5 loses to d3, and queen e7 loses after knight d5. It's complete disaster for black. In order to keep c7 pawn protected, queen has to get off the e-file, and then after d3 white is winning. So what I am gonna do on this DVD is I am gonna bring number of very interesting games on the highest level, and you will see,
My extensive teaching practice has shown me that club players rarely manage to get standard book openings in their games, which means of course that the vast majority of opening material is simply irrelevant to their needs. I've come to the conclusion that an alternative approach is advisable, one based on being practical and cunning. The lines I'm going to show you in this video might be dismissed by the purist as being dirty tricks. Personally, I think that such objections are just nonsense. The question you have to ask yourself is whether or not you want to win more games. The lines I'll be showing you loosely form the basis of a repertoire. Alternatively, you can pick and choose from amongst these ideas for those that most appeal to you. The move that I normally recommend to my students is 1e4, because it's this move above all others that leads most of the sharp tactical clashes that develop our combinative skills. After black's reply e5, I suggest going one step further by playing an old-fashioned gambit opening like the Danish with d4 or the King's Gambit with f4. Now those amongst you who don't respect such openings should note that Garry Kasparov himself has played the Evans Gambit. Most black players, when faced with these openings, will be very nervous indeed and probably react very passively. After f4, I would expect that a lot of your opponents will play something like 2d6, just trying to defend their pawn on e5. Unfortunately for black, this is rather a bad line, because all his pieces now, especially the bishop on f8, are badly restricted. Play could proceed with, say, knight c3, and after knight f6, white could play knight f3, and then if black defends his pawn on e5 with knight out to c6, white can pin this knight on c6 with bishop b5, once again renewing the threat to the pawn on e5. If black defends, say, with bishop d7, then white can play d3, once again threatening this pawn on e5. Sooner or later, black will probably give up the centre with e takes f4, and after bishop takes f4, white's pieces will reach an ideal deployment. Over the next few moves, white will castle, then be able to mobilise his central pawns, say with d4, and bring his queen's rook into play, say with queen d2 and rook a e1. It's very difficult to get such good positions after so few moves with something more respectable like the Rye-Lopez, which just shows the benefits of adopting a cunning and psychological approach. One of the most simple and effective strategies in chess is an all-out charge against the opposing king. Some niggling positional players may dismiss this kind of play as being primitive, but the very same players will quake in their boots when they see you marshalling your forces for the attack. On this video, I'm going to show you how to create devastating build-ups against the enemy king right out of the opening, and in which an understanding of where the pieces and pawns should be placed will be more important than any knowledge of theory. Before anyone complains that such a single-minded approach can't possibly be good, let me show you just how devastating it can be. Let's look first of all at the old-fashioned Italian game, or guaico piano, which I'm sure every chess player has had in his career. e4, black replies with e5, white brings his knight out with knight f3, black defends the pawn on e5 with knight c6, white plays his bishop to an aggressive diagonal with bishop c4, and black replies in the same way with bishop c5. White now develops this bishop on c1 with d3, and black develops his king's knight with knight f6. Now let's suppose for a moment that white doesn't play what's probably the best move with knight out to c3, and instead plays the perfectly natural castles. Black plays pawn to d6, and now let's suppose that white plays his bishop out to g5, again something that looks like a perfectly natural move. Black hits this bishop on g5 with h6, and now white retreats the bishop to h4. Well, you may wonder what can possibly be wrong with that, but in fact it's probably a decisive mistake. Black lashes out with the move g5, and after bishop g3 follows up with a tremendously powerful move h5. The threat is now to play h4, trapping this bishop on g3. So white really has to do something quite sharp in order to try and get out of this mess. If he plays knight on f3 takes g5, then black can play a spectacular move with h4 in any case, ignoring this threat to the f7 pawn. Now if white plays knight takes f7, black can play a really spectacular move. h4 takes g3, sacrificing the queen on d8. White has to take this queen now, there's no other way out. So knight takes d8 is forced, and then black can uncork a spectacular quiet move with bishop on c8 out to g4, hitting this queen on d1. The best move for the queen is queen d2, after which black follows up with another quiet move, knight out to d4. I'm sure you're wondering if this can possibly be enough for a whole queen, but I can assure you that it is. It turns out that black's kingside attack is actually winning. If, for example, white plays his knight out to c3, there follows knight f3 check, throwing another piece onto the bonfire, and after g takes f3, black plays bishop takes f3, which threatens to play g takes h2 mate. If white meets this with HG, which is really the only defence against GH, then black's rook screams down the board, rook H1, mate.
If you really want to improve at chess, you could do a lot worse than to have your own personal stock of secret weapons. Not stuff one would necessarily use all the time, but little things to catch the right opponent out at the right moment. The arsenal of useful openings I've assembled for you on this tape should reward you handsomely with over-the-board points, and that, of course, is why I chose them. Throughout, the emphasis is on variety, enjoyment, and above all, practicality. We'll avoid predictability like the plague. And if this original approach enables you to become a better and more versatile player, then the objective of this tape will have been achieved. We're going to concentrate on three very interesting openings. The first of which is the pseudo-Trompowsky, and that starts d4, d5 when white plays bishop g5, an aggressive approach recently championed by Adams, Miles and Hodgson. I haven't seen anything on this anywhere written down, and so this is trailblazing analysis. Next up, we'll be looking at outlandish new analysis from the correspondence chess world in an ancient opening. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, an opening we can all recognise instantly, the two knights defence. And I'll be showing you some fantastic new analysis in this line where black can play knight takes d5, a move dismissed in all the books as a blunder, yet I believe it's perfectly playable. And after all the tactics, we'll go rock solid with an easy to understand, little used but completely sound variation for black, Lasker's defence to the Queen's Gambit. Every chess player should have a reliable line like this in his or her defensive repertoire. Thanks to the phenomenal success of the Trompowsky attack, that's bishop g5 in this position, in recent years, more and more top grandmasters are turning to 1d5 as a way to meet the Queen's pawn. And I imagine this has filtered down to a lower level of chess as well. A lot of players are playing d5, whereas before they were playing knight f6. And the last thing I assure you that people want to see if they play d5 is the move bishop g5 here. Nevertheless, this is the move we're going to analyse on this particular video, and I think it's a very good idea. Now, one of the reasons why I think this move will be very successful at club level is that it puts the onus on black to come up with something almost immediately. Black has a wide choice of plans here, and thus wide opportunity to go wrong. Let's look at the advantages of this move. Firstly, and most obviously, it inhibits the natural movement of black's e-pawn. I mean, this is a typical move in Queen's Gambit positions. Black is denied that move straight away. It dissuades the move knight f6, although as we'll see, black can try this move and go back into a type of Trompowsky position. We'll see a particularly interesting new idea against this move. And thirdly, black at this early stage has got to find a plan of campaign. I mean, he can easily drift into a bad position after this move. For instance, one thing that many black players will do will just be to aimlessly chase this bishop around and then to suddenly end up with a compromised position. So it's a very interesting idea, and I believe it demands your closest examination. I propose to look at the following replies for black. Firstly, we'll take a look at 2 knight f6. A very natural move by which black goes back into a Trompowsky. Then we'll move on to looking at the move c5, whereupon I'm going to recommend e4 as an interesting and exciting way of blasting open the game. We'll go on to looking at solid setups for black, where black plays 2c6 or 2 bishop f5. Obviously these are quite reasonable ways for black to play. And we'll conclude with a section where black is chasing the bishop around. First of all, he plays h6, or he may try an overtly aggressive move, f6. But as we'll see, white can maintain good chances against each. On now. Welcome to the second in this series of 21st century secret weapons. Are you ready to terminate your opponents with this state-of-the-art information? First up on this video, I'll be looking at a great new attacking scheme for white in the Queen's Gambit declined TARRASCH. Then we'll be moving on to examine a fascinating, unstereotyped line to crunch the Caro-Can. And we'll finish off with a complete repertoire for black in the O'Kelly Sicilian. The TARRASCH defence of the Queen's Gambit begins as follows. White plays d4, black d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and now the characteristic freeing move c7 to c5. Now if a grandmaster's faced with this opening, he's going to churn out the main line. C takes d5, just to show you that main line. E takes d5, knight f3, knight c6, and then g3. Well, you can play like this as white, but you have to learn mountains of theory. Well, in keeping with the surprise repertoire I'm going to recommend on this tape, let's have a look at a very little used idea, which was first brought to my attention by British junior Simon Williams at the European Championships in 1995. It's a rather surprising gambit. C takes d5 is played, black plays E takes d5, and now we kick off with Frank Marshall's old move, e2 to e4, completely blasting open the game. The recommended antidote for black is to take on e4. D takes e4. And now comes the surprise. Marshall's original idea was to go d4, d5 here, establishing a wedge in black's position. And even though this variation is not used very much, there's still a lot of theory accumulating on this variation. So just moving the pawn back, how about this crazy move, bishop f1 to c4? Well, obviously this is a very aggressive move, and the main idea behind it is that white wants to play queen to b3, attacking the f7 square. And in fact, he's willing to sacrifice quite a lot of material in order to get this attack against the f7 square. Now, if you look in all the textbooks, Batford chess openings, the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings, even the standard reference works on the Queen's Gambit, you won't find this move. And this is why it's such a good secret weapon, because I actually think it's very good for white. Well, the game we're going to look at now is the game Mar versus Vukovic from the European Junior Championships, Żagań in Poland, 1995, where after we'd had this session discussing this idea, Karl Mar, as white, decided to try it out. And his opponent played the main line, or what has become established as the main line, that's C takes d4. Before we get into the actual games themselves, I'm going to give you a menu to show you exactly what I'm recommending on this DVD. The first white opening we will consider is Larsson's opening b3. A reasonable enough way to start the game, and it must never be forgotten that Larsson won many beautiful games with this opening. That was then, this is now. I'm recommending that black meet Larsson's opening with the slightly unusual but perfectly respectable d5 and bishop g4. This promotes a sharp struggle if white tries to hunt the bishop down after h3. It's kind of a reverse Trompowsky, but in all cases black gets a reasonable game. Going back now to the opening move, go all the way back. The next opening we'll take a look at is the Tsiolkovsky opening b4. This is of course a much sharper approach than b3 introduces, and once again I'm going to be recommending the move d5. But after bishop b2 we're going to sharpen the game up straight away with queen d6, putting the question to the pawn at b4. This is an approach favoured by the veteran East German Grandmaster Wolfgang Ullmann, and we'll see a nice game of this where he wins in excellent style with queen d6. It's an interesting move. Black sets a trap. If white plays b5 in this position, the queen can come into b4, forking the bishop and the pawn. But there's far more to black's queen move than that. If white plays a3, black can grab the centre with e5. This is a good approach by black, and again, completely recommendable. Let's drop back one more time. Now we come to the move a3, Anderson's attack. Not seen very often, but a crafty move. White is going to play a reversed opening. Whatever black plays, white will respond as if he's black with the extra move a3 thrown in. Usually this will involve black in a kind of reverse Sicilian, and the way Anderson interpreted it back in the 19th century was to follow a3 up with a quick c4. Against a3, I'm recommending a King's Indian approach with g6. Quite often we reach a typical position in many Queen's Pawn openings where the move a3 has no bearing on the position whatsoever. Black can play a kind of King's Indian or Grunfeld setup with complete confidence because a3 has no bearing on that type of structure. So g6 is a good reply to a3. Going back one more time, we then come to knight c3, which is of course one of the best of White's irregular first moves. Against this move, I think black should stick with d5 once again. And White has a couple of ways to transpose back into normal openings, or to try to. He can play d4, which is usually going to transpose back into a Queen's Pawn opening, probably the Verisov. Well, against that, I'm not interested in letting White play e4 for free, so I recommend bishop f5. I think this is the complete answer to knight c3 and will give black a good game in all lines. If White plays bishop g5 in this position, angling for a Verisov, then h6, bishop h4, and now c6 is a very good approach, intending queen b6. This is the way grandmasters play this position with black, and well, it's just pretty good. Going back to knight c3, d5, die-hard knight c3 players will often come out with the move e4. This goes directly back into an innocuous variation of the Scandinavian, where d takes e4, knight takes e4, and now bishop f5 gives black a very respectable game. Basically, black gets a kind of Caro-Can position in reverse, where he hasn't even moved his c-pawn yet. This gives black the opportunity at the right moment to play c5 in one go, undermining the white centre, and this should secure black pretty comfortable equality in every line, as we will see. Going back to the opening, the next one we're going to tackle is the unruly Grob. Okay, I know of a lot of players who play this move in club chess. They know the tricks, they know the traps, and they win a lot of quick games with it. Well, I'm going to recommend that black respond with d5 once again, and if bishop g2, the traditional Grob approach, I'm going to perhaps recommend the slightly unconventional exchange sacrifice after bishop takes g4, c4, d takes c4, allowing white to take on b7 and to take on a8. Yes, white has won the exchange, but in all other respects he has a completely ghastly position, and we'll see that this is an enterprising and pretty good way of tackling this.
Well, hello everyone, International Master Andrew Martin here once again, and welcome to Volume 1 of my Anti-Gambit guide. On Volume 1 we're going to be looking at gambits which occur after 1 e4, both for white and for black, and suggesting ways to meet these tricky openings. The first opening I'm going to look at is the legendary King's Gambit, starting with 2f4. Now, in the early days of the King's Gambit, this opening was used almost exclusively as an attempt to bash black flat. And back in the 19th century, white was very successful using these brutal methods. As sophisticated defensive ideas for black emerged, the King's Gambit's popularity tended to take a nosedive, and there was only a very few grandmasters, certainly, who were willing to risk it at the highest level of chess. But at club level, this opening has always been popular. But of course, among players who know it. You can't play the King's Gambit simply from scratch, it seems to me, because it's too risky. With f4, white opens up the king side. Well, you know, he offers black the chance to try and take advantage of those weaknesses. In return, he's going to try to get the centre, or to start, as I said before, a dangerous attack. Now, the method I'm going to recommend to you very much tries to put the boot on the other foot. It tries to put the ball back in white's court, and we're going to try and meet the King's Gambit with d5, e takes d5, and now the Nimzowitsch counter gambit with c6. I've always had a fondness for this approach by black. It's a very dangerous counter gambit. I don't think many white players, certainly at club level, are going to be very happy to meet it. Because, well, rather than accept the gambit and subject himself to white's initiative, black is offering a gambit of his own, hoping to get the initiative himself. So to start off with, let's see what happens if white takes this gambit with d takes c6 and allows black to play knight takes c6. Well, it can quickly seen that for the pawn, black has already opened up lines for all his pieces. This can only be a good thing, and with the white pawn on f4 looking rather lonely and the white king side rather bare, it seems to me a very poor practical bet for white just to take on c6. And indeed, in the coming game, Lazard versus Tartakova, an old game played in Paris 1929, white gets smashed up using this approach. Well, Lazard played d3 in the game, and now black played bishop c5. Now this is the ideal square for black's king's bishop. I think in the gambit accepted, where white takes on c6, black should always be looking to put his bishop on c5. And of course this turns the heat, the spotlight, very much on white's king. White hasn't got any pieces developed yet, and it's hard to see where he's going to put his king. It's going to take him an age to cast on the queen side, and casting on the king side actually looks rather tricky in this current situation. Well, Lazard played knight c3, and what I like about this position for black is that he can simply develop his pieces quickly and effectively. And that's exactly what Tartakova did. He played knight f6, and then he castled. Next ideas include perhaps bishop to g4. Knight maybe comes into d4, that's another idea, and certainly black is thinking about putting a rook on the e file, rook e8. Hello everyone, Andrew Martin here once again, and welcome to the second volume of my anti-gambit guide, where we're going to be dealing with gambits after the move 1d4. Now clearly it's much more difficult for either player to stir things up quickly after 1d4, because play is predominantly of a closed or semi-closed nature. After 1e4 you tend to get wide open play, and it's much easier for the pieces to stream out after that move. After 1d4 the game takes a little bit longer to develop, and so chances of successful gambit play are decreased because of this feature of the position. Nevertheless, there are a number of very important gambits to consider after 1d4, and I'm going to tackle the major ones on this DVD. And the first one I want to consider is, well, probably the most important of all in my view. It's the Benko gambit with 3b5. Now anybody who plays white against the Benko gambit will tell you it's a jolly hard opening to face. The gambit itself had its origins back in the 1930s in the games of Swedish players, Opczynski, Stoltz, Lundin. It was Paul Benko, the Hungarian emigre now living in the US, who brought this opening to prominence back in the 1960s and 1970s and had phenomenal results with the idea. So good that a lot of grandmasters instantly started taking up the black system. And back in those days, black got fantastic results with this gambit. White takes the pawn, black plays a6, white takes again, and then black would recapture with the bishop. For the pawn, black gets a very easy development plan. He gets open queenside files, and he gets the initiative. He gets a safe king. Altogether, terrific value. And this is what a lot of players who wanted to get onto the attack early liked about the black system. However, well, since then actually, since the early days when black got such fantastic results, attention has tended to shift towards variations where white declines the gambit. And there are plenty of those which we could play, but I want to take this variation head on, and I'm going to suggest you accept the Benko gambit, if only for the reason that a lot of Benko gambit players these days expect you to decline. They don't expect you to take them head on and accept the pawn. Well, I'm going to show you an interesting system that white can play against this line, where he does in fact take the pawn. Here we see black setting up his formation, and now the twist. Knight to h6,